What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 123, and I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I'm interviewing former U.S. Army Major Danny Sjursen. He was a professor at West Point. He is a fellow of the Eisenhower Media Group. He's authored several books. He is the co-host of the Fortress on a Hill podcast and a prolific anti-war writer who has a weekly column at antiwar.com. So I'm very happy to have Danny back on the show. Today we're talking about some issues that we have talked about in the past in Mali and NagornoKarabakh. I think what Danny has to say is really important because these interventions are set to ramp up in the near future, and if we're not aware of what's happening, then it's going to be a lot harder to read the news and to know what's going on. So I think everybody's going to really enjoy today's show. Be sure that you share it. You find it at the video versions on YouTube and Odyssey, and also at the Libertarian Institute, which hosts the show, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for the full archive. You can support the show by following us and sharing the content on our social media sites, Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter. And then you could also give us some money at Patreon or Subscribestar. You can help the show and help yourself by getting your CBD products at Paloma Verde. The URL is palomaverdecbd.com. Again, palomaverdecbd.com. And when you check out, you use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, for 25% off when you spend $75 or more. Now, Paloma Verde has a variety of great CBD products. They infuse their CBD products with different kind of extracts and natural supplements, and so you could get yourself soft gels with melatonin to help you get to sleep. I get the sports cream. It's a topical. It has a nice menthol smell. It's very refreshing in the morning, and it really helps to take away any pain. So check out palomaverdecbd.com. Use the promo code PEACE when you check out. You'll get yourself a nice discount. You'll help the show. Now let's get to the interview with Danny. Hey, Danny, how you doing today? Welcome back to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. Glad to do it, as always.
Well, I'm always glad to have you on, but then again, a little nervous about when we do, because we always talk about these conflicts, and a lot of times we're looking forward at what's potentially coming, and far too often you're correct in your negative, I guess, outcome predictions. So I think we got more bad news for people on today's show, but let's start it off with a good note here, Danny, and that is your most recent article for us at antiwar.com on Daniel Ellsburg and 50 years since the Pentagon Papers were leaked, which it just seems crazy. I don't know, I guess I'm 30 years old now, but it seemed like, that was pretty recent history when I was born. And at 90 years old, Daniel Ellsburg, he doesn't look 90. Biden's out there stumbling around. Ellsberg could give a speech, and he did a pretty long interview with Scott Horton in the past couple of months. That guy is still sharp. He's still there. And you've also recently written on Daniel Ellsberg's more recent leak on some Chinese or from the 1950s, but the U.S. planning to nuke China, and how this is Ellsberg challenging the state to use the Espionage Act against him. So I just kind of want to let you open up and say what you want about Daniel Ellsberg. I'm sure, like myself, he's a hero of yours. So go ahead.
He is. He's incredibly sharp. Thank God for it, right? There are certain folks out there that I think to myself, they better live forever. Had ever since he had the Pentagon Papers, which essentially shows that there was serious consideration, and every general basically was for it, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, of nuking China's cities, okay, before they could get a nuclear bomb, preemptively, preventively, right? So this, of course, is illegal under international law, but since when have we cared about that, right? We didn't care about it in 1958. We don't care about it now. The timing of it, though, is not just because his lawyers told him repeatedly that if he released this document that he didn't release with the Pentagon Papers, that he would face serious, they didn't know if they could defend him, basically. That was one of the reasons, but that's not the real reason for the timing. The reason for the timing, and he said this, is because as the Biden administration acts like it's a dovish administration because they're pulling a few thousand soldiers out of Afghanistan, which I support, they're also saying we're going to change our posture to be even more combative towards China. It's like back to this pivot to Asia thing. Except now he's rallying, just recently, like the last few days, Biden and company are rallying the troops in NATO, getting Europe on board for this new Cold War, this provocative policy that cannot end well, and you cannot win, right? You cannot win a nuclear war. Risking even the possibility of it is inhumane. It's a crime against humanity. That's why he released the document now. He wanted to show us something that I tried to show my students, which is before you sanitize your country, before you mythologize it, before you aggrandize it and think that things are so well, remember the things that it has been capable of in the past, even the recent past. And what we found out in this document is that as recently as 1958, but even after that, the United States was willing, seriously considering, only Eisenhower shut it down, basically murdering millions of Chinese babies of a non-nuclear state on behalf of Taiwan, a non-treaty ally. That's relevant because if a new war starts, and there's a lot of speculation on this in establishment places like Foreign Affairs, like there was an article recently in Foreign Affairs, right, that polite, establishment policymaking analysis, place from the Council of Foreign Relations, right, saying here's the reason why there might actually be a war over Taiwan. If there's a war with China, if there's a war that goes nuclear in Asia, it is going to be over the South China Sea, keyword there being China. It's funny, that's like they're Caribbean, but they're not allowed to they're not even allowed to have real serious presence there. We want to be preeminent everywhere, or it'll be in the Taiwan Strait. And there's still a lot of ambiguity about whether America would back Taiwan. A lot of argument over this. Of course, it's absurd to do so. And I think that's what he's attempting. But, I mean, kudos to Daniel Ellsburg for continuing to cause trouble, good trouble. And the thing that was a little darker in my Pentagon Papers commemoration article is I'm talking about how this is a time of apathy. And Daniel Ellsberg is a corrective to that. He's almost like he's a canary in the coal mine. He's not the only one, but he's basically saying, look, we need to care about this stuff. And he's concerned about the apathy. One of the things he always talks about is that there's a lack of an anti-war movement, the lack of an engaged citizenry on foreign policy, right? People can get pretty fired up in the streets over racial justice, policing. Great. I'm glad. But not a whole lot of concern for black and brown bodies overseas, though. And, that some of that's changing. And there's been some solidarity with the Palestinians, for example, from things like Black Lives Matter. But Daniel Ellsberg's been saying, wow, 20 years. And he said, and I quoted him in the article, he said basically, if the new Pentagon Papers comes out, it really wouldn't change anything, And I asked the question at the end, hypothetically, the next time the new Ellsberg releases the new Pentagon Papers, will anyone even notice? And will we even have a commemoration in 10, 20, or 50 years after that one? I'm not so sure.
Yeah. I mean, that is a great point, especially what happened with the Afghan papers that the Washington Post put out, which weren't the same thing as the Pentagon Papers. The leak wasn't the same, but at the same time, we're still within a year or two of that, and there's really been no reckoning. Even now, we recently have Matt Spoot writing in the Washington Post that Afghanistan shouldn't be a lesson that counterinsurgency can't work. That's his great take on the argument, and that's what people are defending. So they don't learn a lesson. Also, with the leaks on that, I want to point out my friend and a frequent guest on the show, Patrick McFarlane, has been telling me about this book by Admiral Stavridis, who was the NATO allied commander for a while. And it's called 2034, I believe, and he predicts, the novel he's writing is in that year, the U.S. and China will end up in a war, and then it escalates to nuclear war with a U.S. tactical nuke in mainland China. And so, if this is in a fictional novel, but being written by somebody who was doing the, planning for U.S. warfare between the U.S. and China, well, it's probably something we should still pay attention to.
Well, and the fact that Admiral Stavridis is considered a serious, Even the mainstream left considers him like a polite admiral. He's one of the smart ones. He's one of the rational thinkers. He's of course not, and he's dug the with the war industry consulting kind of world. He's dug in deep with like the Afghanistan study group folks. A lot of these people are his colleagues. He's been hawkish on Afghanistan. He wrote ridiculous op-eds arguing that we should stay in Afghanistan essentially indefinitely, along the delusional line that 5,000 soldiers is going to shore up the Kabul government in a long-term sense. It doesn't surprise me at all that he would talk that way. And let us also be clear, he's a Navy man. And the Pacific is where the Navy finds its relevance and identity. The Navy has always loved the Pacific. That's their theater. They are always pushing for a pivot to Asia. And this reminds me of something I've said on some other interviews, a very interesting thing about the Pentagon knife fighting. And to what extent are the people in the Pentagon, these generals that everyone loves and adulates, to what extent are they worried about national security and the good of the homeland? And to what extent are they worried about their budgets and the good of their service branch? And the more we get a professionalized military, right, that doesn't have a draft, that is increasing like the Praetorian Guard, it's a family business that's like passed down generation to generation. The more we have that, I can't help but wonder if the real loyalty of a lot of these people is to their service branch, even after they retire, or the war industry that pays their salary 7 figures after they retire. Because back during the Cold War, an Air Force general bombs away Curtis LeMay, responsible for the firebombing of Tokyo and Japanese cities with about 500,000 civilian deaths on his conscience and his hand. Well, I don't know if he had a conscience. He became chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and he was talking to some of his staff officers, one of whom, like a captain or a major, was giving him a brief. And in the brief, he referred to the Soviet Union as their enemy. And he said, no, Captain. He said, make no mistake. He said, the Soviets are an adversary. The Navy is the enemy. And so my point there is that it's not just a football game, Army, Navy, Air Force, Navy. It is jockeying for relevance. Relevance drives budgets. And so every command, every branch wants to show that there's more likely to be active combat, more of a threat in their region that they're most preeminent in. And so everyone now is scrambling to show why they're relevant in Asia, even the Army, which traditionally doesn't like Asia because of that whole Princess Bride quip, which is correct, where he's sitting there about to drink the iodine or the powder or whatever, the iocane powder, and he says, you fell for one of the great blunders in history, the first of which is never start a land war in Asia, right? Because the Korean War and fighting the Japanese, which was pretty brutal, taught us that too many casualties if you try to fight a country with 1 billion people and too large of a landmass. But now even the Army has written new documents, new policy and strategy documents, basically arguing that they have a role in Asia and wanting more forward basing out there. And so this is all absurdist at a catch-22 level. It's insanity. And Daniel Ellsburg is trying to point all that out by putting his own freedom at the age of 90 on the line. When my grandmother was 90, she just died, she was 99, Wheel of Fortune, and I don't blame her, was about that's all she wanted to do with her twilight years. And Daniel Ellsberg wants to fight for press freedom and try to stop a war in any small way he can. And
Right.
good for him for it.
Yes. Yeah, it's so important for that reason. And I know as well the Army is, I think, looking at building some precision missiles or something that they're going to try to deploy on the little island chains out in the South China Sea, and spending billions of our dollars on that. But to finish up this Ellsberg part here, I guess, and to tie it into that too, Danny, where you were a member of the Army, major. You taught at West Point, but it was at least while you were teaching at West Point, you were writing articles for antiwar.com and writing articles and going on the Scott Horton show. And I, remember Scott used to have to say at the beginning of all of your episodes that, your viewpoints represent you and not the U.S. Army as a whole. And so I guess, just it doesn't have to be a whistleblower like Daniel Ellsberg that has all the RAND Corp documents that he could leak in given access to all of that, but just being willing to speak out against, the state institution of whatever military branch or something, and for the truth is so important. So, you're, I think, a part of, while I don't know if you would call, or anybody would call you whistleblower, certainly a part of that legacy of speaking the truth that we definitely need a lot more of at this time when there are just so many different excuses for war, especially with China.
I'll do a rare thing, which is give the impression, maybe, I hope not to, but that, I'm saying something positive about myself. But in a recent talk for Massachusetts Peace Action, Daniel Ellsburg had very laudatory things to say about me. I didn't even know that he knew me. This was just a couple of months ago, and he was talking about that. And a lot of times I feel really guilty about the fact that I stayed as long as I did, which I still feel guilty about. I have a lot of that. I feel like I should have done more. I should have. I was hardly a hero. I wasn't a traditional whistleblower. But I think this is instructive. I got to thinking about why Daniel Ellsberg would call me out in a positive way in a speech. And then I got to thinking about why, when we were emailing back and forth more recently about these articles and stuff, he was saying like that, I'm one of his sort of heroes of this generation. I wanted to vomit in a trash barrel, to be honest, because I'm like, if he knew that I can't sleep at night because I feel like I stayed in decades longer than I ought to have, and I was complicit in the great crimes of my generation. So I don't feel that way about myself, but I got to thinking about why he might. And it's because this is an uncomfortable fact. The little bit that I did that I paid almost nothing for, besides, I was under investigation, and, you're scared of, you get like a little bit of social ostracization. You lose, you lose a certain identity because it's not done. Fact is, when I was writing articles on active duty that were anti-war, when I was speaking anti-war and published my first book on active duty, I was the only one, certainly among the officers. That does not make me brave. It makes everyone else completely and utterly complicit, way even worse than I was, which was very bad. It blew my mind. I make this joke all the time. I have the phone number, and I regularly text with. I have an ongoing text thread with almost all of the relatively serious public, at least, anti-war dissenters who did it while they were on active duty or when they first got out. That's not because I'm so cool socially. That's because there's so few of us. And that's part of what I'm talking about with this apathy. We're nothing compared to Dan Ellsberg in terms of the risks that we took. But there are so few of us. I used to start to think I was crazy in those early years when Scott was having to say the views of Danny, everyone, they, don't reflect the Department of Defense. Because I was the only one, or one of the only ones at most. I mean, one hand, right, at best, that you would count them on. I started to think I was crazy because there's 500,000 soldiers in the U.S. Army and almost 100,000 officers, plus you throw in the other branches. I don't know. It's jarring sometimes, and that's part of why this last article on Ellsberg probably had a little bit of like a fatalistic tone to it, a little bit of doubt about whether we're screaming into the dark, because I think there's a lot of structural reasons for this, but there are not a lot of dissenters in the military or in the security establishment any longer.
Well, I gotta say, from my perspective, it seems like the numbers may be growing. Me and Will had on a member of the Air Force who's currently in and has some pretty anti-war views, and we spoke with him, and we agree on pretty much everything. And he's just like one of many others that I've met and have reached out to me. So, I hope it is the actions that you and others are taking there, making it maybe more comfortable for other people to come forward who have these thoughts and stuff. But if you read Danny, who your byline at antiwar.com is Major Danny Sjursen, right? Like, if you read You Say It, that maybe breaks down some of the more like religious kind of barriers that people have to trying to set these ideas, right? You have to, everybody in the Army knows the Army is great. And so if you're in the Army and you read Danny, who was in the Army, saying that what the Army is doing isn't great, then that's, more powerful than Scott Horton or somebody else saying it. So I think that is really important. But Danny, let's get into talking about Mali here, where we had another coup, and I've had you on the show to talk about Mali a couple times now, and honestly, I didn't think we would be talking about another coup this fat fast. In fact, when I Googled Mali coup this morning, 3 Wikipedia entries came up. I think it was like 1980 something, and then one in 2020, and then 2021. And so who knows how many more we're going to add, but what's going on here? We've had articles from you and discussed it on the show with you in the past from the perspective of the Franco-American Forever War in North Africa, and specifically the role that Mali is playing. So I'll let you take it where you like, Danny, and tell us about this coup.
So this is absurd on a number of levels. One of the things in the United States military's own counterinsurgency doctrine is that whether the United States is the primary counterinsurgent force, like we were in Iraq and Afghanistan during the surges, or whether we are the advise and assist support element for a host government, a host nation government, they call them HNG. The key thing is that in order for there to be a success, by our own measures and our own books, and I'm critical of some of these counterinsurgency books that make it seem like it's so easy to do, it says that the key component is there has to be a legitimacy to the central government that you're backing, the local central government, in this case, the government of Mali down in the south in Bamako. Now, it's very difficult to have a government that appears to have legitimacy when it's not only ademocratic, but it's consistently being completely thrown into turmoil by military coups, by putschists who call into question who's really running the joint. Right now, it's unclear. Mali is in disarray, and it's getting worse. So all that military aid money that's going in, all those American advisors, all those French soldiers, not 5,200 of them, the largest military mission of the French overseas since when? The Algerian War, which was like a massive war from 1954 to 62 that almost took down the French government. There was a coup attempt in their army in France. You know, all that intervention, all that AFRICOMing, all that AFRICOM adventurism, as I call it, has actually made Mali worse, has actually contributed to nothing. At the very least, it's failed utterly, and more likely, it's proven counterproductive and destabilizing. How do we know that? I don't know. Anyone else like math or maybe chemistry? How about we talk about half-lives? You know, half-lives, like of plutonium and uranium, you know, these substances, you know. Mali has had 4 military coups since 1978. The difference from 1978 to 2012, the first half-life cycle, for those of you who are scientifically inclined, was 34 years. 34 years between military coups. Then, in 2012, the military stepped in again and took over the government. And it was until August of 2020, so 8 years, so 4 times faster than the first half-life cycle, that we had a military coup in Mali. In August 2020, we had our third by this guy, Goita, this colonel. Gotta love this guy. If you're into authoritarian military rule, like let's say you're an enthusiast for that, let's say you're an aficionado like Hemingway was for bullfighting. If you're into coups, this guy is your hero. And I'm not really a coup fan, it turns out, but some people are maybe. There's got to be a subsection. There's something for everyone in the internet age. If you are, this guy did 2 coups in a 9-month half-life cycle, right? Which is like 12 times faster than the cycle before, because he overthrows the government in August of 2020. Now, for those of you who are parents, you might understand this general stricture. If your kids do something crazy, right, if they do something bad and you let it slide, it is likely that they will think, well, I got away with this the last time, because that's kind of how it works. Well, if you're a military putschist, if you're a coup artist, and you got a little bit of a slap on the wrist last time, but then France, your number 1 military backer, which has, you know, most of their 5,200 troops in Mali, backing your government, if they basically say, all right, don't do it again, but we're not going to pull any of the military aid that's propping you up, then you might try again. So when they forced the transitional government of civilians to step in a few months after the August 2020 coup, which Donald Trump didn't do a whole lot he didn't impose a lot of consequences either. Let's be clear. When he didn't like this like notionally civilian hybrid military regime that came in, that was the transitional government until the elections, they started to show a little too much independence. What did he do? He stepped in for a second time. I got to tell you, even in Africa, even in Francophone Africa, which has had 60% of the 80-something coups, or 60 or 80-something coups in Africa since 1960, when most of the countries got independence, even in Francophone Africa, the former French colonies, which have had the majority of those coups, it's got to be a record to have 2 successful coups in 9 months. So if you're into that, folks, and obviously I'm being tongue-in-cheek, Goita is your hero. He is the Babe Ruth of coups. He is the Michael Jordan or the Tom Brady. He is the GOAT. He's the GOAT of indecency, though, because in the process, average Malians suffer. The civil war gets worse. It's unclear who's leading this thing. And he is the 8th coup to happen since AFRICOM was founded by a U.S. military trained and advised officer. Let us just back up for a second here. AFRICOM, which is the representative of the indispensable nation, self-styled, which is the representative of the greatest force for democracy and the last best hope for the planet, self-styled, the United States. AFRICOM, the newest of our military commands, formed in 2008. Since then, there have been 8 military coups by officers trained or have gone to school in America or have been involved in operations, but basically trained by the U.S. military. He's the 8th one since 2008. I mean, we're averaging almost one a year. And at this rate, with the half-life cycle, we're going to have some real coup bonanzas. And I'm being tongue-in-cheek because I'm upset about it. It's not getting the coverage it deserves. Africa never does. It gets a little more than our next subject when we talk Nagorno-Karabakh later, but this is really bad. And now, though, France is in trouble. And then I'll kind of like pivot back to you to kind of do the follow-ons. But Emmanuel Macron finally sort of announced that, maybe there's going to be sanctions. I don't know that there really will be. And that he's ending Operation Barkhane, which is the longest French military operation, since 2013. It's been going on, of the largest intervention since that Algerian war. It's really the gold standard for French interventionism and neo-imperialism in Africa in the modern age. He ended it, but he's unclear about what that means. It seems to me, from the rhetoric I'm seeing and the past track record, that probably what's going on here with Emmanuel Macron is that, he's under pressure from the left and the right with an election coming up, sometime in 2021, and at the end of the year, I think. But nevertheless, the right wants more French force to be used overseas in Africa. The left wants it over. And for the first time, the majority of the French public, which usually doesn't care, is usually actually very pro-war. They don't pay much attention to what's going on overseas. They're a lot like us. That's why we hate them so much and why they hate us so much. We're like little brothers that are exactly the same. We're both exceptionalists and universalists. But the thing is, he's ending Operation Barkhane in name, but it's unclear that means all the troops are coming home. I think what we're going to see is a repurposing to something that's a little more abstract, a little more surreptitious than it really is. But what's certainly clear is that this has failed. And despite in his speech where he announced the end of Operation Barkhane saying that, actually it's had an enormous amount of successes and touting the successes, how successful can an operation be when the cornerstone of that mission and the genesis for it was Mali, and Mali is bloodier than ever. The insurgents are killing more people. The security forces are killing more people. And the governments are less democratic than they started, less legitimate than they started, and military coups are, it's a fire sale on military coups. Right. So this is an utter failure, and AFRICOM finances the whole thing, is in the wings providing intelligence, and wants more money in the next budget, always does. And AFRICOM is like one of the great absurdist enterprises in American military history, and I'll go on the record and say that.
Yeah. No, I mean, what you're describing there, we have books now written about what the U.S. did through the School of the Americas and all the Latin and South American coups, as especially during the Cold War. I mean, this really puts that to shame. Now, there are quite a few more African countries, and so maybe if you do the math, evens out to about as many coups as they are doing in Latin America or so. But the devastation that we now know from those kind of policies and books like the Jakarta method and stuff like that is absolutely unbelievable. And here you are trying to warn about it in time that this is going to be the kind of thing that in 50 years the country looks back on is like, oh, that's an ugly part of our history. That we're engaging in right now, we could stop it. So I had, I guess, kind of just two maybe follow-ups, Danny. One would be with the French mission changing. I tried to keep a very close eye this weekend on if there was any reporting from the G7 or from NATO, possibly of Macron trying to talk to Biden about that. Because look, if the French war shifting down, maybe they keep the same policy and the same influence in the region by shifting the burden to the Americans. That seems like a very possibility of what could happen with the French mission. So I was wondering if you have any concerns about increased American involvement, and then and again, just like with the region being, there's a recent coup in Chad attempt, and the killing of the longtime dictator there, Deby. Do you see this? What, even if the U.S. doesn't step up its mission in Mali, what is it going to do about the increased instability in the general Sahel region that we did a whole show on with Will Porter pretty recently, and what do you see, I guess, are the regional consequences of this?
What I've been saying this on the show a few times. It hasn't really panned out just yet, but there are really worrying signals. What Macron is counting on, I mean, his Hail Mary, because he's in kind of a rough political situation right now, actually, in France. And he's got the right wing, he's got his generals, thousands of soldiers, and dozens of generals signing letters basically saying there's going to be a civil war if he's not harder on Muslims within the Benelux in France, and isn't tougher on the source of them as far as they see it, which is Africa. He's got that to contend with. He's got a majority of the public for the first time that's against these wars. I mean, he wants a bailout. He wants a bailout. He wants a stimulus package from AFRICOM, and he wants a Biden bailout. Whether he'll get it or not, at least to the level he's hoping for, is questionable. But he's already getting a minor bailout from the EU. From the EU, isn't that interesting? The EU, which is always often touted as sort of like the non-military or the non-militarist wing of NATO, sort of, is actually getting highly involved. And they have almost every EU country has sent special forces to a special training mission in Mali. They are contributing a lot of aid money. The British have sent a cavalry squadron down there. One of the first and only instances in history of certainly post-colonial history of British soldiers intervening in a francophone country. In fact, in many cases, Britain and France still jockey for influence and power in what's called Anglophone Africa and Francophone Africa, the former colonies of each, which just proves that neo-imperialism is real. Neocolonialism is not a myth, like the neocons would have you believe. They all share a neo. So, if your prefix is neo, it's not good, whatever comes after it. But nevertheless, the thing that matters, I think, most here is that the well has been poisoned for all of these operations before they even began. And the poisoning of the well was colonialism, a continued sort of de facto colonialism after, a refusal to either allow the countries themselves to maintain the independence and work their way through a very difficult post-colonial transition to democracy, or to help them with that. None of the operations that are done across this entire region, or really anywhere in Africa, deal with the foundational problems of endemic, systemic poverty, disparity, ethnic and regional sort of gaps in terms of government services, desertification, corruption of these governments, the fact that many of them are strongmen led or led by generals and colonels, like military coups. All those foundational problems, send 100,000, send the 82nd Airborne into Bamako, and I promise you, when they leave, it'll be worse, not better. No matter how many early gains and press releases from Africans, they did great. My point is, even a Biden bailout, even an EU Biden kind of joint bailout, is not going to have success. I promise you. Like, I'm not saying I would like push my 4-year-old down a bed of reeds, Old Testament style behind it. Like, I'm not necessarily going to bet my second son on it, but I am so certain I'd empty my bank account because it's never worked. And doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different result per Einstein is insanity. We've done nothing to change the situation, so why would we expect a different outcome? Macron, of course, is a delusional sort of liberal interventionist, which is basically a cult in terms of it's like a it's like a crazy religion at this point. It's a delusion, and yet it maintains a serious following in the capitals of these Western countries. But Chad is a great example recently, and Mali, and actually every one of these countries that a military solution with an illegitimate government that we help make illegitimate will not work. I mean, let's just real quick. Chad just had a military coup after its longtime dictator, brutal Idris Deby, was killed fighting rebels. So that's out. Nothing good's going to come from them, and that was considered like the gold standard of our proxy. Go over to Niger. They had a coup attempt recently. That government hasn't solved any of its sort of foundational problems. They were the same as the ones I've described. U.S. soldiers got killed there in 2017. No one even knew they were there. That region is getting more violent. If you look at where Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso meet, it's called the Tri-Border region. That Tri-Border region is an absolute nightmare right now. Violence is at a higher rate in 2021. Death, violence in that region, cross-border, than it has ever been. This is also the first year that the security forces in these countries killed more civilians than the insurgents. That's never a good thing. A village in that area in Burkina Faso was just wiped off the planet, basically, with up to 132. That's the official count. It's closer to 160, probably. Civilians massacred. So Niger's out. Burkina Faso was considered the success story of an unsuccessful region until 2015, when its first outbreak of insurgency began, for largely the same reasons as in the other states. It's received enormous amounts of military aid and advisors now, and it's having its bloodiest year. Mali in that region, northeast and the northwest, is having its bloodiest. It's having its bloodiest year of all. Oh, by the way, Burkina Faso had a short-lived coup attempt. Well, it was successful briefly in 2015 as well. So they've had one. Niger's had one attempt. Chad has had, I'm talking since AFRICOM was founded. Chad has had one. Mali has had 4. Mauritania had 1. I mean, this is a nightmare region, and we have, at the very least, not helped. And the truth is, the United States and France have been one of the greatest drivers of violence in this region. If military interventionism was supposed to make things at least marginally better, then someone needs to explain to me why 10 to 20 times more people are dying in conflicts today as were dying at the founding of AFRICOM in 2008. Nobody ever grapples with that. You won't read it in the New York Times, at least not in such direct language, but I prefer plain language.
Yeah. I guess the other thing there that you didn't put a whole lot of emphasis on, and I was just wondering what you think. So you're pointing the founding of AFRICOM is really the starting of all of the violence in this region. I guess in the past on the show, I would have pointed to the Libyan intervention, and so I mean, I guess the two kind of feed off each other, right? If AFRICOM doesn't exist in 2008, who knows if we had the Libyan intervention and the NATO war in 2010, 2011. But I guess how much does the Libyan war factor into all of this that's happened?
Libyan war is the gift of the grotesque that keeps on giving. I like me some alliteration. Taking down Gaddafi for under false pretenses and an utterly unstrategic thing to do had its blowback, which is that's the trademark of American and French foreign policy. The French pushed for Libya. I said this on the last show more than anyone else. The Republicans were yelling about how, Obama said he's going to lead from behind. Like, what a wuss. This is proof he's not tough enough. That ain't the story at all. The story is France has been fighting proxy wars and even losing scores of its own soldiers in combat since 1978 with Libya's Gaddafi. So they always had, a hard on for Gaddafi in Libya. So they were really pushing for it. Of course, they ran out of bombs because their military, even though it's one of the strongest, it's the strongest in Europe besides the Turks, but technologically it's stronger and it's the most capable of deploying its forces overseas, the most expeditionary. It's still nowhere on the level of the United States. It still needs a U.S. resupply slash, kind of assist. And, they pushed for Libya. We were all about it too, but they were one of the driving forces diplomatically. So at that point, two things happened. Gaddafi, three things. It fell into a state of civil war, which is still affecting the region. So it's terrible in Libya. It's caused a proxy war. Everyone's taken sides. Russia and France are on the same side. Turkey and, the UAE are on the other side of this civil war. It's a nightmare. But two other things are the Tuareg Arab Legion, some of the elite soldiers in Libya's forces, because Gaddafi styled himself the sort of king of the nomads. He was the supporter of the pan-Tuareg. They're kind of like the Kurds, except they're over a bigger area. They're stateless people. They live in northern Mali, some in southern Libya, northern Niger, northern Chad. They flew over the border because they were going to get slaughtered by the rebels, and their guy was gone, Gaddafi, so they left, but they took their guns with them. They emptied a few of his arsenals out, for good measure. Mm-hmm. And Gaddafi had a lot of guns. He had enough guns that he could ship them to the IRA in the 70s and the 80s. This guy made more guns than he could use. So they came across the border. So now you've got angry, anti-American, frustrated, basically mercenaries who've been working for another country, right? So they got military training, they got a lot of guns, and they came home and they destabilized the entire region. They said, you know what, maybe we'll just overthrow the governments here, because one of the reasons they went and fought for Libya is that the Tuaregs, like the Kurds, have been a marginalized people who have been sort of on the outskirts of the power structures in their home countries. It all connects. There's an AFRICOM hand, at least an assist. They're like the John Stockton of indecency in Africa. Right, for those of you who grew up in the 90s. I mean, there's an AFRICOM assist behind almost every nightmare in this region. And you know what AFRICOM says? This is what they say every year in the budget process. They say, give us more. If we just had more, we'd do even better. You should see how good we're doing. Well, I don't know what side they're on, but it's certainly not the side of stability or democracy.
Right. Yeah, I guess it depends on what your definition of better is. There's certainly more for them to do. So if that's what they're looking to create, then they're doing a hell of a job. But Danny, let's move on and talk about the Nagorno-Karabakh situation, which of course is the fighting that broke out in later 2020, around the time of the it was U.S. election season. So if Americans had no idea this was happening, I wouldn't be surprised. And I mean, in some sense, rightfully so, right? Like, what should we care about what's happening between the Caspian and Black Seas? Like, it doesn't seem like our issue at all, really. But at the same time, Danny, when violence breaks out any in the world, but particularly on the border of some countries the U.S. has a lot of interest in, like Georgia, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, a NATO member, there's going to be calls for U.S. intervention. So I was hoping you could kind of catch us up and recap what happened in 2020 and where that left us. And then I've been noticing some recent reporting that the violence has stepped up in the region, that there's accusations on both sides of cross-border incursions and soldiers being killed. So, then we could go on from there into why, this is relevant to talk about at this time.
I think, just from a cold strategic rationale, I think that summarize why this region matters to the U.S., outside the fact that, 6,000 people died in the last fighting in a month and a half, which is a way, way higher rate of casualties in a war than, say, the Ukraine conflict in Donbass, which gets way more attention, doesn't it? I mean, that's been going on since 2014. And I'd have to look at the casualty count, but it may be about 20,000, right? Nevertheless, 6,000 in a month and a half is a big deal. But let's put that aside. There's a lot of reasons, and each of them has a single name, that this region matters. One, there's the natural gas factor. Azerbaijan has a lot of natural gas. There's this like mythology that we're going to be able to cut Russia out in their supply of gas. It turns out that the supplies are not enough, but Azerbaijan and Europe have like been banking on this for a long time. So Russia providing most of the natural gas to Central Europe now and Western Europe. The United States would like to see that not happen, right? Because they want to be able to count on NATO when they decide to start a ludicrous war that could end the species. So there's one factor. Now, I always like to go counterclockwise. I don't know why. Maybe I'm an opposite thinker. Then you got Russia right to its north. It matters because Russia is the main power broker in this region, or used to be, and they do largely provide the most stability, and that's one of the complicated things. Like Russia, rather than being an escalator in these situations, especially this time around, is the peace broker. And I predicted that, if you remember. I'd said, like, if this thing, and I said that in the Real News Network in a profile, I said, if this thing gets put back in the freezer, because they used to call the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over that orange area, which I'll get to, that it was always been called a frozen conflict because the war ended in like 94, the original war, which lasted from like 88 to 94. I think like 60,000 died in that one. The Russians, so that was called a frozen conflict because it was basically like a tenuous, there was some shooting at the border and it wasn't getting solved, so it was a frozen conflict. But I said, if this thing gets put back in the freezer, if this latest flare up in September kind of calms down and there's a ceasefire, it's going to be Russia that brokers it. Like Putin's putting it in the freezer, and he did. Then you got Georgia, which wants to be in NATO, and it's still the official policy of NATO that Georgia's coming in eventually. Russia, of course, fought a war in 2008 saying, we're not going to allow you to put another NATO country even further east in our backyard. Georgia thought we would back them, so they started a war. No one remembers that. Like, Scott talks about it all the time, Scott Horton. Most people don't remember that. Georgia started that war with Russia, and then Russia, bloodied them up a little bit, and we didn't intervene. We didn't back them. Go down to the south from there, you got Turkey. Turkey was the most responsible for this latest war. They wrote a blank check to Azerbaijan, and they outfitted them with vital drones that they needed, and even shipped in thousands of Syrian mercenaries that they had previously used in Libya and Syria to come fight for Azerbaijan, a major violation of international law. Of course, Turkey's a NATO member with the second largest army in NATO. So Turkey's on the exact opposite side of Russia to some extent, because technically Armenia is a part of the CSTO. I forget what that stands for, Collective Security Treaty Organization, maybe. It's like Russia's like much weaker and much less aggressive NATO. So Turkey is ethnically Turkish, obviously, and Azeris are ethnic Turks as well. And so Turkey is very much aligned with Azerbaijan and encouraged them, literally, and fully backed them to invade this Nagorno-Karabakh region. And I'll get to why that matters. Below them is Iran. Iran's actually been pretty quiet about this whole thing, but they watch very carefully because Iran is like 30% Azeri Iranians. So northern Iran is mostly populated by Azeris, not Persians. So there's that problem. Also, one last country, why it matters, good old Israel, our favorite militarists in the region. Despite all this idea that, every Muslim country is against Israel and Israel's against every Muslim country, actually, Israel sells an enormous amount of its arms to Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan was the second largest purchaser of the Israeli military industrial complex of guns and bombs from Israel, and specifically some of the most effective drones that were destroying the armor of the Armenians, which is why the Azeris won this war, this latest September one. So Israel's a big backer of Azerbaijan. Of course, they don't just do that to be nice. They do that because they're looking for a jumping off point for their operations, a counterbalancer to Iran, and because Azerbaijan is essentially like a Mossad base. Okay, like Israel's CIA has been very active there. So what happened essentially is that in the 1988 to 94 war, Armenia won, and that area that's shaded basically, and that has like the dotted lines around it, is Nagorno-Karabakh, which is an enclave that is vast majority, and has been for a long time, Armenians ethnically, which also means Christians. And so when there was ethnic fighting, it was just another one of these post-colonial calamities where the way the lines were drawn by like Stalin, literally in the 1920s when he was the Minister of Territories Commissar for Territories for the Soviet Union, they drew the lines in such a way that they gave this enclave of Armenians to Azerbaijan. they want to be part of Armenia. So anyway, war starts when they were trying to have elections to like, join Armenia. Azerbaijan wasn't really having that. Armenia wasn't going to let Azerbaijan keep them. They fought this war. Armenia wins. But and then it was just like a stasis. There was like a basically a stalemate. But Azerbaijan, which has way more people, a way stronger military, and way more money because Armenia has no natural resources, Azerbaijan was kind of biding its time. And once the military balance tipped in their favor, and they had all the support from Turkey and Israel, and then they thought they had the natural gas card so that NATO and the United States wouldn't back Armenia, and also NATO, they figured, wouldn't back anyone that was vaguely aligned with Russia. When they felt they had the blank check, they invaded, and they beat up on Armenia pretty bad. Now, they didn't stop there, though, and that's what you're talking about here. And I know I'm drawing on, but I think it's important to get the backstory because this is not something that gets reported on a lot. Most people don't understand this conflict because they have like real social lives. But like I've been studying this for a long time. So Azerbaijan is not ready to stop. They're led by a guy who's been called the mini Stalin of Central Asia or of the Caucasus. His father was the dictator before him. These are guys put like their faces up on billboards and stuff, like hence the mini Stalinism. So the rhetoric coming out of Azerbaijan now is, you know what, we don't want to stop here. We want more we want all of Nagorno-Karabakh back. And you see that little enclave there on the very southwest of this region where it says Azer period. I forget what that's called. It's called like the something something corridor, and it's majority Azeri, so it doesn't touch, right? It's a detached enclave, just kind of like the Russian Kaliningrad region, which is in like the old Eastern Prussia. Azerbaijan now is saying that space in between, that Armenian sliver there, which is a majority Armenian, they're saying, I think what the quote is they're saying that they need a full-fledged transportation corridor because southern Armenia, quote, is the historical territory of Azerbaijan. So what we have right now is Azeri revanchism and irredentism, very dangerous rhetoric. And now on the ground, the Azeris took 4 more kilometers worth of territory past the ceasefire line recently. There's been some shooting. There's been some prisoners taken. And when they took that new territory, they took over the heights, like the most important military tactical ground, like the hills and the mountains. And they started building fortifications there. Now, along some parts of the new tenuous ceasefire lines, the Armenian and the Azeri military posts are 15 meters, less than 15 meters between them. All the seeds, rhetorically, strategically, diplomatically, and even militarily on the ground are there. And here's my awful prediction. The half-life of this conflict flaring up is going to really decrease too. I see the seeds of a new war just totally brewing. So much so that who remembers what was happening last year between India and China up in the Himalayas and the Hindu Kush? These guys were like beating each other with bats in the snow, remember? And like 40 of them were killed. These days, there's videos all over the internet of this. Azeri and Armenian troops, they occasionally meet in that no man's land of only 15 meters, right? Between them. I mean, they could play ping pong across the ceasefire line, right? It's even worse than World War I. Occasionally, they meet to like discuss this or that and try to keep the peace. And fights have been breaking out between the two sides because they're still so angry and antagonistic. And there's videos of like people, they're like having fist fights along the line. You know, even if the leadership on both sides wasn't calling for more war, especially the aggressive Azeris, accidentally, it seems almost like by necessity there's going to be the seeds for this new war. So that's the terrible prediction I have today.
Yeah. Well, Danny, I know we don't have a whole lot of time, and I want you to finish up with any of other thoughts you have on this. But I did want to get your take on, I guess, because Turkey is the NATO ally to the U.S., how important is their role here? And I guess, is this kind of driven by, the Turkish president Erdogan's kind of idea of being like an old Ottoman sultan and having more and more influence in the region? And uh, I guess just how dangerous is this? And also, you point out there that Turkey was involved in shipping some of those Syria fighters to Azerbaijan, and those some of those guys are real jihadist radicals that you have to worry about. And also, I would imagine for Turkey that this is kind of probably solving a little bit of a problem for them, right? As assuming that eventually Russia and Syria with Assad will be able to take back all of Syria's borders from at least the Turkish backed rebels, if not eventually the U.S. backed ones too. Those fighters are going to have to go somewhere, and they share a border with Turkey, but I'm sure Turkey doesn't actually want a bunch of jihadist nutcases running around in their country, as useful as they've been in Syria, Libya, and Azerbaijan. So I wonder just, how maybe helpful is it to have a conflict going on to have some of these guys go fighting?
Well, that's the interesting part. I mean, these Syrian jihadists that the Turks were backing for so long are very useful right now, but they're ultimately a problem. Turkey's got 2 million Syrians at least in refugee camps. A lot of them, a lot of the military-age males, are from the more Al-Qaeda Islamist aligned factions within Syria, like Nusra Front. Turkey's been backing them a long time, but I mean, perfect world, they would like waste them like cannon fodder doing their bidding until there was no more of them to come back to their country and destabilize Turkey. Because they know about blowback. They saw what happened after the Afghan jihad with the Mujahideen. I think that Turkey is the number one bad guy in this story. And they're backing the number two bad guy, who's the dictator, Aliyev of Azerbaijan. If this thing goes bad, and it really could, it'll be Turkey that's to blame. And think about this for a second. Like, let's juxtapose NATO Turkey, supposed democracy, with supposedly evil Putin and Russia. Let's juxtapose their roles. So if this thing goes bad and it breaks out again, Russia is going to be really concerned about the influence of not only these Islamist Syrians who get dropped in the conflict, but they don't want to see Armenia get like pummeled either. They didn't come to the aid of Armenia really, even though by treaty one could argue they are supposed to, that CSTO treaty, but that was shown to be, on paper only, and way less ironclad than NATO, which is supposed to be like the good alliance, right? But if this thing goes really bad, Putin and Erdogan are on a collision course, right? Turkey and Russia. And because Turkey's a NATO member, that's really awkward for us. And also Israel's really pro-Azerbaijan as well. So that gets really awkward for us because they're our most ironclad non-treaty ally. Then what? Now you have Russia and Turkey on opposite sides of active proxy civil wars in Syria, in Libya, and now in the Caucasus. But the Caucasus is Russia's Mexico. It's their near abroad. We don't give them, they're not allowed to have any spheres of influence. The world is our sphere of influence. The world is our playground, right? Because we're good people and they're bad. But that's Dagestan right there, where it says Russia. That's the Russian Republic of Dagestan, right? But it's part of Russia. That's where the damn Boston Marathon bombers came from, that region. That's the Muslim section of Russia, which Russia has lost at least 1,000 of its troops fighting insurgencies throughout that region. They're not going to be able to stand aside, just like they wouldn't stand aside in Georgia, while they're near abroad. They're basically Juarez. That's how close it is to them, gets destabilized and potentially has spillover effects into Chechnya, Dagestan, of these Syrian fighters. It really could set up the seeds for like a major regional conflict, if not something bigger. And the myth of Russia as this expansionist monster, this new Soviet empire or new Tsarist empire, that Putin is this revisionist power. This is the language you'll read in the New York Times. The number one way to deflate that as always Russia's policy or its preeminent policy is to talk about Nagorno-Karabakh, to talk about the Caucasus, because Russia sent peacekeepers to guard. There's Russian troops right now guarding the ceasefire lines along a lot of the lines to try to keep the Azeris and Armenians from pummeling each other with their fists like they currently are, 15 meters from each other. But Armenia several times said to Russia, come on, intervene, save us. The Azeris are invading. You're our treaty ally. CSTO, it's supposed to be like NATO. Russia could have used Armenia as this CSTO cudgel to like expand into its old republics, because these used to be part of the Soviet Union, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. They could have used that as the cudgel. Like if they were so much like that, if they were so expansionist, wouldn't they have used Armenia and intervened and said, look, that's just like NATO? Instead, they didn't want to fight down there. They didn't want to get drawn into this in a serious way. They want as much stability and quiet down there as possible. They got their own problems with their economy. They got their own problems with their insurgency in the northern Caucasus, like near Dagestan and Chechnya. So what they did instead is they found a loophole, and it kind of works. They said, Nagorno-Karabakh was never officially part of Armenia. You occupied it in the last war, and we know there's a lot of Armenians there. It's all Armenian, basically. But because it's not technically within the internationally recognized borders of Armenia, we are not under the obligation of collective defense to come to your aid. So we'll help broker the truce, which was basically done in Moscow, with the lead of Putin in the lead, after France and America both failed to broker a ceasefire, which I knew would happen because they don't have everyone's there. They said, we'll help you out with like a ceasefire and we'll send peacekeepers down there, but we are not fighting for you. We're not defending you. We're going to let the Azeris beat your butt, actually. This, to me, is like the number one regional explanation of the fact that Russia is not a monolith. It is not some expansionist new empire with unlimited power that's 10 feet tall. It's only that way in our brains. And that's a political decision in the United States that has more to do with domestic politics and the military-industrial complex than it does with realities on the ground. So that's the last thing I want to say about that, which is a lot, but I think it's super damn important. And so everybody, read more about Nagorno-Karabakh if you want to find out that a lot of the rhetoric about Russia is what it's always been: mythology, delusion, and farce.
That's such a great point, Danny, because everybody will point to the examples of like South Ossetia, Crimea, and Syria as the way Russia always responds. They're always looking to exploit everything. But this is a clear example, at least one, of that not being the case. Danny, thank you so much for coming back on the show today. You've been writing a ton of great stuff at antiwar.com. The Fortress on the Hill podcast, which is you co-host that, has been cranking out some excellent episodes. Anything else that you want to plug?
Yeah, no, just check out the EisenhowerMediaNetwork.com. It's that new organization of anti-war vets, different ranks, different branches, somewhat similar to me, many of them more prominent, like Larry Wilkerson. But if you check out our website, we're always booking people on shows. We're publishing their stuff. We're getting them, we're pitching them in as much mainstream media as possible. And we're a small voice. There's 12 fellows right now, the 12 apostles of anti-militarism, and they're all veterans of the military, mostly of combat, and then some also FBI intelligence types. But check us out. You're going to be seeing more of us. It's a really great group, and we're going to expand.
All right. Thanks so much for coming back on, and we'll have to do this again soon. And hopefully, we won't be talking about your predictions coming true, but it looks like the path we're taking. Thanks, Danny.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.